John, what's up, man?
Hey, bud, what's going on?
Living the dream. How about you?
Oh, just trying to get through winter, man. Can you get the fuck out of here? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. I'm glad I'm catching you before the fishing season because I figured you'd be in a better mood.
I'm actually in a worse mood, man.
Because you're not on the water?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, you're scaring me. How long do we have? We can make this show like 10 minutes. I'm kidding.
Huh.
How long have you been fishing? I was thinking about it today when the last time you and I fished together, and it was either in Jamaica Bay slaying big stripers at the end of the runway, or it was Montauk.
Yeah, I think it was actually Montauk. You're right. Um, how long have I been fishing though? Jeez. I guess so. This will be my 23rd year owning this business. It's nuts, right? How long have I been fishing? Jesus, since I was fucking 7 years old, dude.
Well, that's true. You started out though, when we first met, we were a little younger. And it was probably 23 years ago. I actually think you and I met online because you were writing fishing reports for real time,
Yeah.
and you seemed to be a hardcore guy. And I tracked you down to do fishing reports when we were doing fishing reports for Worldwide Angler and covering that. So, but
Hmm.
at the time you were working, were you in the Coast Guard then?
No, no. I got out of the Coast Guard in '99. I think I think that was back when I was the executive director for CCA New York.
Ah, I forgot about that. I was thinking you were at Norcross, but yeah. So for listeners, can you explain a little bit about CCA? Because this will be on a fishing show, but it'll also be on a non-fishing show, so listeners won't know what CCA is.
Yeah, I got you. CCA is the Coastal Conservation Association. It's a recreational fishing advocacy group, I guess you describe it as. Some of their advocacy has to do with conservation. A lot of it has to do with access these days. I kind of ran that New York chapter, did all their fundraising. I did that for a few years before I started to do the grant stuff at Norcross.
You know, that CCA thing I was thinking about the other day, John, because we're actually working on a movie, short film. I don't know if it's going to be a short film or a series on the idea that nonprofits are broken. And for listeners out there, CCA made their name in Louisiana. I can't speak this morning. Originally by getting nets, I guess, banned in Louisiana, and
Mhm.
it was a very organic thing. And then that group of individuals, I think, believed that they could take that model and do chapters. And John, you were at, like you said, New York, and I at the time was at a very small CCA Maryland on the board of directors. And I think at the time we all believed that we could take that model and do the same thing. But I think, and you just made a comment which makes me even think more, John, that it was really a one off, and it wasn't a replicable, they didn't have a replicable process. They had a very organic, I mean, if I remember correctly, because I studied that at some point when I was on the board at CCA, thinking like, why aren't we making that progress? And they were doing crab boils. Like, they have a very different culture down there
Yeah,
where
hundred
they did
percent.
that, and then you throw it in New York, dude. Like, I mean, people don't say "f you" to people's face in Louisiana in general, but in like New York, it's a little bit rougher, right?
Yeah, 100%. And again, I think a lot of these successful movements, like you said, grew organically around one particular issue and kind of flourished from there. And I guess to some extent we had that in New York with striped bass, but the recreational fishing community in New England and the Mid Atlantic really is quite a bit different than it is down south. There's a lot of disagreement. Nobody is really on the same page. Everybody is fighting with each other, and it's kind of that my way or the highway approach. And it's interesting that you guys are doing some work on how ENGOs are broken. because I kind of hold that opinion too, and it kind of goes along with the whole political situation that we have now. Everything is so polarized, and nobody is reasonable anymore. Nobody believes in compromise, and absolutely that manifests itself with nonprofits. And it's definitely different than when you and I were involved. And I try my best not to associate myself with any of them now, because they all discredit themselves at some point by taking these views that are just kind of don't take into account other stakeholders. Um,
Yeah.
I guess at some point, we should talk about the Guides Association. That kind of was an organic thing that happened, and it's I'm not so much involved with it as I was over the last couple of years, but I was on the commission then, and a group of party boats
Which
ended up.
commission, though, just for
Okay, I'm
listeners?
sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I was actually the proxy for the legislative commissioner. Each state has three commissioners. One of them is a legislative commissioner, somebody that sits on the New York State legislature. And I was the proxy for a senator named Phil Boyle. And a bunch of party boats went into his office one day and said, "Hey, man, McMurray's not good for jobs. He's too conservation focused." And that we need to get rid of this guy. So, before I knew it, I was gone. And I'm like, what the hell, man? This handful of guys don't represent the fishing community. They don't represent your constituents. So I was like, well, we need to have an organization too that is, more of a generic representation of what captains actually believe, what charter boat captains and guides actually believe, and that's that conservation benefits us. Having fish in the water benefits us a lot more than how many we could kill, because people went fishing just to fill coolers. I mean, it's a hell of a lot cheaper just to go to the fish store. But the idea behind that was that having been on the Mid Atlantic Fishery Management Council for 9 years and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission for another 6, was that those managers always tended to look at the recreational fishing community as kind of like this wealthy elitist group that plays with their fish, and that wants to have some conservation of that resource so they could continue to torture and release these animals, whereas the commercial guys and the party boat guys were kind of like these blue collar, hardworking guys that just trying to keep their business afloat. And I think with the Guides Association, we were able to communicate that we're hardworking business folks too, and that we need to stay in business, and we benefit from conservation, and the entire fishing public and the public in general benefits from sustainability and conservation. Can you hear my dog right now? I want to punch her in the
Yeah,
face.
we like to keep it real here on the show. So, I mean, isn't that the life of a fishing guide with their dog?
Yeah, yeah. Hold on a second. I'm gonna put her outside. All right, give me a second.
Okay,
All right. Come here, you dummy.
we'll be right back. And
All
we're
right,
back.
man. I'm back.
I know the feeling. I got 3 dogs in a kennel, one Jack Russell, one poodle,
Oh,
and
nice.
one crazy mutt. But so we were talking about the Guide Association and
Mhm.
representing yourselves, that you are also hardworking individuals who couldn't be discounted because you were just not trying to make a living. I mean, being a full-time guide, quite candidly, is hard as hell.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that message resonated with managers, where that was something that hadn't been communicated before we started this organization. But yeah, to run something like that, you really need a full time staff, and we were able to generate some funding to get that. And so I've kind of stepped away from it a little bit. It seems to be running itself, and my focus right now is fishing, man. That's kind of I always told myself since I was in my early 20s that I was going to retire when I was 50 and start a charter business. Turns out, that happened 12 years ago. So, I kind of followed an interesting path here because I think a lot of folks think that they could just say, I'm going to start a charter fishing business and, make the investment in a boat and start it right up and have it be self-sustainable. But I had kind of a unique situation. I got out of the Coast Guard. I worked for CCA for a bit, and then I worked for Norcross, for another 10 years after that. And both of those jobs, I was allowed to kind of run this charter business while I was doing it. And I had good bosses at Norcross that didn't mind me doing that as long as I took them fishing every once in a while. And that was an interesting board of directors because it was mostly fishermen and hunters on the board, and they all had that enlightened self-interest in protecting resources. So I kind of fit in there well. But over that course of 10, 12 years, it allowed me to build that client base up to when I was able to let go of the Norcross stuff. I was able to do it full time.
Yeah, and for listeners, Norcross is a foundation that gives equipment grants to conservation organizations. Did I get that right, John?
Yeah. There's no longer a grant program, though. They're just
Oh,
maintain the
really?
land that they owned. Yeah.
Got you. But I think it's a good lesson, and we're switching around here. I want to come back to fisheries conservation, but
Yep.
the on the business side, everybody thinks, and this is not unique to fishing guide. I think it's actually potentially harder for a fishing guide because you have unpredictable, at least in saltwater, you have generally unpredictable conditions. Fish move every day for the most part. Weather, um, humans tend to get sick when they get on big water, even any water sometimes. And there's so many variables, but you ran it as a side hustle. You built
Mm-hmm.
your clientele. So when you just didn't get out of the Coast Guard or go to Norcross or CCA or Norcross for 2 years and then say, hey, I'm going to build this business. And the problem is that your cash flow won't be there.
Right.
And that's a truth with all businesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
And you could do all the you could spend all the money on advertising you want, and you might get a few trips from that, but most of it comes from reputation and word of mouth, and it takes an entire decade to build that. Which
and you
is,
were writing for people who don't know you are a prolific writer as it relates to fisheries conservation, fishing, and these things, and you're in the major and always was in the major magazines writing, contributing. So, and online in the early days, which really matters.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the writing is certainly part of the whole charter business income, and I feel like I have a little bit of credibility when I write something. People tend to listen to it, not just because I sat on the council and commission, but because I'm somebody that spends time on the water that has that perspective. So I think that helps. But getting back to your point about this business being difficult and there's so many variables, and it's really when you look at it objectively, it's probably the dumbest business in the world to be in because one year it's a pandemic, one year it's the fuel prices, one year the fish just don't show up offshore, and I, 3 years ago for the entire month of June I couldn't find a tuna, and it was incredibly painful. Thank God the elephant moved in July, but it's just there's so many variables, and every year it's some sort of catastrophic mechanical failure or something outside of your control. And the workload. I think a lot of people think you just jump on a boat with their stupid captain's hat on, whistling a tune from Popeye, and catch fish, and then come home and eat dinner with your family. It's not like that at all, man. My day generally during tuna season starts at 2:30 in the morning. I'm usually throwing a cast net, trying to get bait, and it doesn't end until 6, 7 o'clock at night. When I got to get the boats fueled and everything. I got to fix all the things that the other captains broke on the boat because they don't give a shit about my equipment. And I mean, when you break everything down, you figure you're working for probably under minimum wage. But at the end, you gotta really love to do it in a way that's perhaps not healthy. And The interesting thing that I've found since I've been doing this full time is that you get so used to that kind of grind, or that you get up early, you're home late, you're constantly hustling. You get a little bit addicted to that, and what you even get more addicted to is those adrenaline dumps when things happen, and you hook fish and you're having a good day and you're yelling and screaming, and all of a sudden the season's over, and it's like you go from sprinting for 6 or 8 months, and then all of a sudden you're not doing anything, and that's absolutely brutal. I mean, fishing in my mind it's an addiction that's almost worse than heroin. You can't stop doing it. And I think I'm going off on the rails a little bit here, but I think there's, having spent time on the council and even the commission, there's always efforts by ENGOs or even government organizations to try to buy out unsustainable fisheries, to try to get people to stop fishing. And you kind of start to understand how difficult it is to tell somebody they can't fish anymore, because that becomes part of you, really, and you really do kind of embrace it in a way that's part of your life, and you can't quit, or else you're a miserable prick like I am during most of the winter.
Well, that's right. I got this is a question I actually occasionally wade in on debates online, John, but and you are a very good fisherman. I mean, there is no doubt. I've known you for a long time, and to catch fish consistently takes it's skill. Like, you have to learn, and you do have to have some instinct. Like, but when I fish Chesapeake Bay, people are like, "Well, how do you know there's fish here?" And I'm like, I just feel it. Like, I don't. I can. It is the weather. It's the tide. It's all these things. But it's also, you can just feel it at some point, and that means you get good. And you've been able to continually do that for many years. But to be that good, John, and you alluded to it, there's this, I think it's total BS that you can have a what do they call it? Like a balanced life. Meaning, and when they say that, they are saying equally divided. Family, divide it however you want, but your job is the same proportion as the rest of it. And I have argued that I have never, ever. Now, this could be justification for me because you know me well enough. I'm like you. I don't do anything in freaking moderation. Like, I think moderation is for people who are effing scared. I mean,
Absolutely.
like, we're gonna do it in moderation. Like, and people, well, I don't drink, and I'm not against drinking. I'm just saying, like, if you were like, "Hey, Brandon, let's have a few beers afterwards," I'd be like, "Why are we having a few, John? Like, let's drink a case or two. Like, I mean, let's do this." And but I have never known, been, or met, or read about anyone who is great, who has any real sense of or not moderation, but balance. Like, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's 100% accurate, and I got to watch how I answer this in case my wife listens to it. But
Well, like, like she's not aware.
no, of course she is, and
I,
it's I'm not going to lie. It's a constant point of contention between me and her, and she's always begging me to take days off, and at one point I agreed to take every other Sunday off, but that just it didn't work out because you might miss 3 days during the week, and to do this you got to run every single day that you can, or else you can't make a living doing it. And plus, it would hurt me deep down inside to have other guys out there catching my fish. I guess FOMO, fear of missing out. I always had that. And of course, the captains I hired to run the boat, they're always, turning the knife and let me know how good they did. But it's you got to go 100%. Like I said, you got to be a little obsessed. You got to kind of put things aside, and it takes a unique kind of person to do that, and you got to have a real good, strong family situation that understands your addiction and allows it to be there without messing up your lifestyle. And I think my wife and my family understands, and I've tried to spend more time with them, but they understand that when I do that, I'm completely fucking miserable and they don't want to hang out with me anyway. So I've kind of worked in, a situation now where they're like, go do your thing. When the weather's bad, that's when we'll spend time together.
Well, I don't think there's I think this thing, and you guys have been together a long time, so I mean, you could be exaggerating a little bit. I mean, it obviously works, and I'm sure there's contention, and you have 2 kids, but I see your son out there with you, and I'm sure you spend time with your daughter. The thing about it is that I don't think the word addiction is the right word. I think it's just who you are. And I think relationships work because people accept who they are and don't, you meet people, and Yvette and I were just talking about this the other night. Like, Yvette knew what she was getting from day one. Not to mention I knew what I was getting. Like, there was choices all along the way. We don't have kids. We actually make the choice every single morning we wake up. Like, people don't really understand that. Like, oh, you don't have kids, it's easy. Okay, well, that's certainly a perspective, but there's also a perspective of we have no external third party or thing as a goal. We don't have a kid to raise. Like, there's no motivation. It is just raw. Do we want to be together today? And, we've woke up every morning for 27 years for the most part. Only people who, and you'll appreciate this. How long have you guys been together?
20 years.
Yeah,
Well, how
20
long have we
years.
been together? 26 years. Been married
So there
20
you go.
years.
You're the same with Yvette and I. I think we've only been married for 15, but the, we live together like you guys and everything, but the, whatchamacallit? Oh, I lost my train of thought. I was talking about relationships, and I just think you have to accept people who are who they are. And if you think that you are going to, if Danielle really thought that she was going to change you, then
Um, no, I
then
don't think she
you
ever
can.
thought I don't think she ever thought she was going to change me, but I also
No,
think,
but if she did, now I'm just using her as an example, and I'm not saying she did, John. I'm just saying anybody in a relationship who thinks they're going to change the other person, that relationship will fail. Yes,
yeah,
I will put the
100%.
pillows on the bed, which I effing hate, but I will do those little things. But fundamentally, like, I am not going to be less intense. I'm not going to stop ask questions. I mean, I did compromise, and I don't generally ask questions after 11, which Yvette has put as a limit. But I mean, other than these compromise, you're just not going to stop. So you want to be great. We're sort of going down a rabbit hole here, but I always want to mention it because I think this narrative of all this crap, these people out there who are like, oh, you need to have a balanced life. Like, I've never met an Olympian who had a balanced life. I've never met a world champion, anybody or a gold medalist or just a like winning human in business or anything who does it in moderation, including moms or dads who are the best dad or the best mom. Like, you're going to sacrifice something. You're not going to stay late at the office. I mean, so I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm more about being real.
No, I 100% agree with that. Everybody who's truly good at something is not just obsessed or not just focused on it, but clearly obsessed with it. And I think most psychiatrists or psychologists would call that unhealthy, but and maybe it is as far as overall happiness goes. But life is not really about achieving happiness in my mind. It's about like the pursuit. Like getting up. What gets me up every morning is like I know that I'm gonna get that rush. I know I'm gonna. I don't think that. I don't think that being healthy or happy is really the goal for me. I think it's being extraordinary at what you do and having a good time doing it. If that makes any
But
sense.
you love what you do, right? I mean, you do
Absolutely,
love it. It's not an addiction as it you're not yes, you get a dopamine rush, but you love what you do.
I do. I wouldn't be working these hours if I didn't. And 100% every single day is different. And every single day I get up, there's that intense that sense of anticipation when you're heading out, when you're packing the boat, when you're throwing the cast net to get bait. Every day that does not get any less intense. And then when things come together like you hope they will, and you get that tuna that crashes the popper and it dumps 150 yards of line in 30 seconds. Um, that I mean, that will never ever get old. and it'll never get old catching schoolies with fly gear. It's just it's awesome. It's almost like you're born with that gene to do that, and that's the only thing that could really kind of give you that sort of sense of accomplishment. And I guess you'd call it happiness. I think that's not the correct word for it, but some people find that thing and some people don't. And I consider myself lucky that I've been able to do that sort of thing.
Why do you I was curious, I've watched you over the years, and to be honest with you, I took a break from fishing. I don't wanna say that I had PTSD, like, but I really did, John. I really haven't fished in I just started getting excited about fishing about and I had a break for 9 years. Now, I also ran an online forum with a bunch of good
Yeah.
people and a bunch of, I don't has unhappy talking about happiness, clearly not happy people, and, I did that for 15 or 17 years, and that'll wear on you after a while, and I think for me, John, in that role, I felt like I was fishing 200 days a year, and I felt like I had to fish, and at that point, I was like, you know, I just gotta do something different, and I think when you feel like you have to, and for me, that's what it sort of turned. So I always warn people, and you've done a tremendous job of loving it, but I also have met guides who are like, Jesus, I didn't realize it was going to be this. Like, be careful what you ask for. Sometimes hobbies are good to keep separate so that you can appreciate them and make money to do them. In your case, you've been really fortunate that you found that match, but in some cases, if it starts to feel like a job, then it can wear on you after a while. I think I had external, Joe Rogan always says, don't read the comments. Well,
Yeah.
if you own the site, you got to read the
Yeah,
comments.
of
So,
course.
um, and I started wading into some online conversations recently. And it's like they didn't miss a beat after 9 years. They're back at it. But, how many charters? Oh, I was going to ask you this. I've noticed that you've switched, it feels like, to more tuna fishing than striped bass fishing.
Yeah. Well, I think to have a sustainable charter business that runs a long time, a couple of decades, you constantly have to reinvent yourself and set yourself apart from the other folks. As I used to kind of focus solely on striped bass and bluefish and doing the fly fishing and the light tackle stuff. Uh, but a couple of things happened there. One, striped bass kind of tanked. I guess 2012 was when we first started to really see a difference, but the fishing just got worse and worse to the extent where you really only had a spring and a fall season. You really didn't have a summer season. And that happened to
Is that still
coincide.
true?
No, it's not. I mean, I don't want to say that we're out of the woods with striped bass yet, but I will say that the last 3 years, there's been a very noticeable uh, increase in accessibility and abundance to where this fall was probably the best one I had. Last fall was probably the best one I had since 2012. Um, but anyway, I kind of all that the decline of striped bass in the early, in 2010 through 2012. We also had resurgence of bluefin tuna. They would come in closer. We had, I think, 2003, 2004 was a really good year class that came out of the Gulf of Mexico, and that's where the Western Atlantic stock spawns. And so we had all these school size fish, 20, 40, 50 pounds. We're actually catching them on fly gear and light gear, and they were, within 10 miles. So I started to reinvest. I got rid of one of the flat skiffs and I bought a 23T, a 25-foot contender, and I started running a little farther out, and I started to get folks interested in it. And I had done the light tackle thing inshore. It was only natural for me to do it offshore. And there weren't any other guys that were running light tackle trips for tuna. There weren't, tuna is generally, at least back then, what folks did is, you book a trip on one of these big sport fishers and you sit there and drink beer while you troll around. Maybe you get a bite, maybe you don't. The niche that I filled is, it's very interactive. You're looking for fish on the surface. You're looking for marks to drop jigs down. You're looking for whales and dolphins anything that indicates that there's bait there, and you fish it with spinning gear. And people dug that, man. And I ended up booking a lot of trips. Without a doubt, right now, most of my income comes from tuna fishing. Um, it's a lot harder to book striped bass. I mean, you look at my calendar now; I'm almost blocked out in July and early August already. When I've only got a few dates in May, and June is looking pretty busy too. But May traditionally was my biggest striped bass month, and I'd be blocked out. By March, I'd be blocked out in all of May. It's become a little more, and that's because I'm kind of more well known as the tuna guy now, and I will book those trips in May. It's just more last minute. But yeah, you really got to evolve, and you got to constantly reinvent yourself. You got to find something that people want to do, something that's new. What's next? I don't know. Maybe it's cobia. They've had a interesting abundance of cobia in the Northeast, and that could continue. I really don't know what's next.
So the for listeners, and I forgot, we'll have it in the show notes so they should know. But you are fishing out of Jamaica. Are you still fishing out of Jamaica Bay?
Yeah, so I have two flat skiffs. They're over in Jamaica Bay, May and June, and then October or September, October, November we do albies. So those skiffs will come out of the water because I don't have a chance to be able to keep an eye on them. They'll come out of the water in July and August. And I'll put them back in September. And then I have the three contenders right in my backyard. We live on a canal, which is nice. I have the infrastructure here to run an offshore business without all the overhead. Give me 1 second. Let me let this dog out. It's driving me nuts.
We'll be back in a moment.
Hey, man, Darren's out there. I gotta get these dogs in. Give me a sec.
Yeah, no problem. And we're back.
Sorry about that, bud.
Hey, no problem, man. Day in the life of being on land.
Yeah, huh?
So you got your boats in the backyard. What inlet is that still? What inlet do you
So
actually
I'm
get?
running out of Jones Inlet, which is western Long Island.
Got you. So how long does it take you to get to the fish from there in general?
It's a little different every year. Usually it's within 60 miles. I don't really do canyon runs. I try to focus on that 40 fathom curve because that's where all the jigging and popping occurs. Once you get to like, 700, 800 feet of water, that's trolling, and that's not really my thing. Yeah, I mean, sometimes you got to run south, sometimes you got to run east. It all depends on where the fish set up that year, and of course where they move. And it's a lot of work, staying on them too. You don't. I mean, of course, they could be there one day and gone the next. And the thing that really sucks, particularly recently, is the fuel prices. I'm burning 250 gallons a day on the 36. Sometimes less, sometimes more. The 31, I'm burning, 100, 150 gallons. 27 isn't much better.
So you have 250 miles, so you're burning $1,100 worth of gas in a day?
Yeah. But, I get fuel a little cheaper than most people. I have it delivered.
Oh, you do have it to your house?
Yeah.
Oh, well, still though, it's still a lot of fuel. How much is a day of fishing cost?
For the 36, it's 2,800 now with the fuel surcharge.
How many people?
Six, but I usually run with four. Four is kind of the comfortable number. It's interesting that I put this fuel surcharge on, and I thought it would cover things. Well, I didn't really. I knew that I could only raise my prices so much without having people start to drop off. So I kind of met somewhere in the middle. Um, and I generally try to keep my profit margin around 50%. But this year or this last season, I didn't forecast. I suppose I did forecast that the fuel prices were going to be a little bit prohibitive, but I did not forecast that everything was going to cost so much more. And
Your gross
sometimes,
your gross margin you're talking about.
yeah, well, my net,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, your net. You try to keep it at 50%.
yeah. I think I
But
don't.
that doesn't take account into your time per hour, right?
No, no. I mean, I pay myself a salary, but you know,
No, right. I'm just trying to do the math. I mean, it with all the hours like you talked about before, if you did an hourly basis, you're probably I don't think you're making minimum wage. You got 3 charter boats going out every day in general.
mm,
Yeah. But that's an expensive day, but how many tuna can you catch? Because, for listeners out there who may not be fishing people necessarily, or fishermen or anglers, they say, well, that's expensive. Well, yeah, but you get tuna to take home. You don't generally catch and release tuna. They usually come home with
yeah,
you in the ice box, but
hmm,
you get fresh. There's nothing like fresh tuna.
yeah, yeah.
How many tuna do you get?
Um, so for bluefin, you could keep one over 47 inches. You keep one that size, and then you could keep three under 47 inches to 28 inches. And then you could keep one trophy per year as an angler, and those are the commercial size fish, the ones over 73 inches. So, generally with the bluefin, we'll come home with three or four fish, and that's if it's a big bluefin. If you're over is 70 inches, it's a 200-pound fish, so it's a lot
Yeah.
of meat. The yellowfin, I actually the yellowfin are smaller. You catch more of them, you kill more, and once you get on them, you catch a lot of them, just as a general rule. And you can keep three per person, but we try to cap it at six or seven fish because you come home and you're having to clean 12, 16 fish, sometimes 19 fish or 18 fish. And first of all, it sucks having to clean all those, even if you got your mates doing it and I'm doing it. I got to get fuel in the boat and they got to be clean and ready for tomorrow. So I hate doing that shit. Um, and the other thing is people don't bring the coolers to put all this fish in. They're like, we had no idea it would be this much, and I end up having to deal with it on my end, which is not terrible because certainly it's not easy. It's
Maybe
easy
you
to get
should
rid of
sell
it.
coolers.
Well, I do. I don't sell them. I have styrofoam coolers, but I think it's more of an issue of the people just don't know what to do with all that fish. So anyway, we capped the yellowfin at seven fish, just because it's ridiculous to kill any more than that. There's no way you're going to eat it, and if it doesn't freeze well, you freeze it
It doesn't.
unless you have a freezer that'll get 40 below zero, which is what the sushi guys do. It when you thaw it out, it's brown. and most of the stuff you get at the grocery store, of course, it's not flash frozen. It's thawed out and it's brown, but they shoot it with CO2 to make it red again, which takes most of the taste out of it. But you know, don't get me wrong. We do release quite a few fish, especially bluefin, and especially the big ones when there's no more recreational quota. And it seems like oh, did I lose you? Oh, there you are.
No.
It seems like that would be difficult to do when you got a 200 or 300 pound fish thrashing at the boat, but we've kind of got it down to a science to where and it's interesting. The bigger fish tend to tire out quickly and become more lethargic once you you beat them up pretty good. You get them by the boat. We basically have what's a giant boga grip. It's an Italian company that makes it. They're called Perdigos, and you just grab them by the mouth, and you pop the hook out and you swim them and you let them go.
Are they as big as what that bluefin? We used to go down to Beaufort every year and fish for that big. Are they in that shallow water right off of Beaufort
Mm-hmm.
over the I call it ridge, whatever the sandbar there? But are they that big?
Again, it depends on the year. We had one
Mm.
last year that was 76 inches, which is about 250, maybe 270 pounds on spend gear. But that's kind of like, that's the top end of what you could possibly get in with spinning gear. Um, to some extent last year, but the prior year we had those giants, those 400-pound fish come in right off of the Rockaways in like 70, 80 feet of water. But you really couldn't get them on spin gear. You kind of had the live line of bluefish or bunker. It's not really my thing, mostly because I have the attention span of a 10-year-old. I can't, I can't just sit there with a bait out and wait for it to get hit. I just, it's not my style, and I just can't physically do it. I can't wait. I get anxious, and I'm like, fuck this, let's go move and try to find some life. But I did do it a few times where I couldn't get offshore because the weather was bad. And I remember the first time I did do it, we threw the cast net on the way out and got a dozen bunker. And I had borrowed my neighbor's 80 wides, and we went out there, and I put one on a circle hook. And as I was letting it out, I wasn't 20 yards away from the boat, and the thing rips the thing out of my hand. And 400-pound fish. I'm like, why the hell am I not doing this more? Because I went out the next day and got skunked, and then the day after that I got skunked. So then I realized, it's more of it's like playing the lottery with that stuff. You go out there with a fleet of 100 boats, maybe a half a dozen of them actually get bit. But that's an interesting fishery because I think it's always existed out there, and nobody really knew it until very recently. I mean, people would always see these giants crashing through bunker schools, but people would run around like idiots, myself included, and try to throw poppers at them. We a couple of guys from the Cape came down here because they caught wind of it, and the commercial guys, and absolutely cleaned up. And it's as simple as getting 80 or 130 class gear and putting a hook on a bluefish or a bunker and just letting it out and floating it on a balloon all day.
So this bluefin fishery is from June, July. Is it May, June, July?
Yeah, and again, it's a little different every year. Sometimes they show up early, sometimes they show up late, but we generally start looking around mid to late May, and you kind of you get a little bit of intel that trickles in, like you hear from a guy on a scallop boat that saw a few, and sometimes you go out there and waste a ton of fuel and don't catch a darn thing that early in the season. But sometimes, like, you're the hero, you're the first guy to get a bluefin all season. That's happened to me more than a few years because I got guys that want to do it. Um,
So then June, July is the hot
June,
season
July is the hot
in
season for
general.
bluefin, and then August and September, or even October, can be good for yellowfin.
Does that weather catch up with you up
So
north,
it
like on
does once,
Chesapeake Bay?
yeah. So once September rolls around, the windows get progressively shorter. That windows meaning how many days you could go out or how many hours you could go out without the weather going to shit. And when the fishing's really good, and it tends to be in October, or even early November, and the fish actually move out to the edge. I mean, last year was absolutely extraordinary. You had a fleet of squid boats out there. If you could manage to get behind one and throw some peanut bunkers, some juvenile menhaden out, you keep them at your boat for hours and hours, and you throw poppers and jigs, throw a beer can at them, and they would eat it. And that was pretty much for the entire month of October and even early November last year. Um, and they were all big fish. They were all 80 to 100-pound yellowfin. But when you get to the later months like that, you find yourself making stupid decisions and trying to go out when you really shouldn't, and you immediately regret it, but you do it anyway. There's a few times last year I really shouldn't have gone, but fishing was so good. How can you help yourself?
Meaning like, like what are you going out in, 6 to 8?
No. It's so I kind of draw the line at 4 foot, and it's not necessarily a matter of whether or not you can or can't do it. It's a matter of how long it's going to take you to plow through that stuff.
To get there.
Yeah, and there were days last October I went and it would take me 3 hours to get out there, but those were extraordinary circumstances. All you did was look on your AIS and find the squid boats, and it was lock and load fishing.
So yeah, I mean, if it's a gimme, it's hard not to get out there. But I've done
Yeah,
that.
I mean,
I
I'm not over exaggerating when I say we were hand feeding these fish. They'd come right up to the boat. You could hold a dead bait in your hand like this, and they come up and grab it out of your hand. It's amazing.
like, are you? I've seen a few of your pictures. Some guys are brave enough to do it on the fly rod.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it seems like at least 2 or 3 times a year, I get guys that are like, "I want to get one on a fly rod. I want to book a trip and get one on a fly rod." And I try and discourage it, not because it's not possible, but because it's kind of a grind,
It's
and
painful.
it's painful. And I don't not do it, but I try to discourage people. I'm like, listen, let's bring the fly gear, let's get a couple in the box, and then let's fuck around. Let's try. And I always have the gear on board. And if it looks like it's going to be fairly, if it looks like we're going to have some success doing it, then we'll break it out. But it's really difficult to run fly only trips for tuna because just the odds of success are so low. And it's one thing to have the opportunity where they're up good and it looks like you could actually get shots at them. It's quite another to hook one and to think you're actually going to land it. I don't care if you've got a 16 weight. These fish are just not meant to be caught on fly rods.
I don't disagree with you, John. I've tried it. Um, but I was thinking, and maybe I don't know, maybe I just got old, but I was thinking when like the best feeling for me when you do, and I grew up doing eels. I think you did eels back in the day
Sure,
too, didn't you? Or
absolutely. Yeah,
striped bass. Like I can still wake up occasionally from a dream of feeling that striped bass pick up that eel and run with it and set that hook. Like there's just no better feeling. And the same thing with tuna
yeah.
happens with
Hmm.
those bunkers, although they really slam it. But John, I don't know, maybe I've gotten old. My thing now is like I just want to hook them and hand that sucker off because fighting those tuna is just evil.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, God, especially with a fly rod. Are you using 16 weights or are you using 14 weights?
So I've got two 14s and a 16. We caught one last year on a 14 weight yellowfin that was about 100 pounds, and that nearly killed the guy. But I feel the same way. I'm getting older too, and I always make it a point to rib the people that are on the front of the boat and call them pussies, and that they can't pass the rod off until I end up getting behind the rod because
Oh,
everybody's gassed out. And after 20 minutes, I'm like, oh my god, this sucks. I don't want to do this. It's such
I
an
gotten
awkward
cramps.
way to there's the pressures that are on your body are just unnatural. It's like your lower back. It's a very uncomfortable position.
I'm screaming at the captain, like, let's fight this thing with the boat and I don't need to fight it. Like,
Yeah.
no hero's journey here.
Yeah,
Uh,
so my
it's, I,
favorite quote about that is it's for the first 30 minutes you're terrified you're going to lose it. For the next 30 minutes you're terrified you're not going to lose it.
yeah, it's your truth, but you don't say that out loud because everybody
No,
on the
you
boat
don't.
will.
And when you get the fish to the boat, there's such an extraordinary sense of like happiness and accomplishment, and everybody's high-fiving and everybody's like that was awesome. I love that shit, man.
So I want to ask you about striped bass because as I waded back in recently, a lot of guys on the Chesapeake Bay who I respect and I remember the days on the Chesapeake Bay and the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, when those fisheries were just, they were epic. I mean, and then I started chasing fish in the ocean, and that was pretty epic for the fly rod. But the general consensus out there, John, is that there's just not as many striped bass, or the fishing isn't as good. And you alluded to earlier in our conversation that you think that we're, coming out of it, or we're better than maybe we had been. And you of all people are, I found, fair, and you know the numbers, and you also know the numbers that are covered up. I mean,
Mhm.
and not told, or I hate to say manipulated, but let's just, like, we're dealing with humans here and jobs.
Yeah.
And when you have humans and jobs, I've found, that's why I got out of the business, John, is because I realized that it was all about jobs. There, like, I can dumb it down every time now. I was at a poker game with some fisheries biologists, and they're like, "Hey, Brandon, you're never going to get the commercial quota cut back." And I was like, "Why? Like, what are we doing here? I mean, you're a biologist, you would understand this, and nets are just very efficient fishing gear. Like, if you want to do commercial hook and line, I'm all for it. Like,
Mhm.
go get it, big dog." But and they said, "Well, Brandon, the people at DNR wouldn't have a job." And I was like, "What?" They're like, "Yeah, they count the fish, they manage the fishery. Those jobs would go away, and that's not in their best interest." So, and at that moment, John, and I'm not exaggerating to you, because I can remember it in my, I'm not going to name names, in this guy's kitchen, where I was sitting at the table, and it struck me, and I was like, I am a pawn in this game. And I am not wasting my time. Like, I'm actually here to do something. And I really do care about the fish. In fact, at one point, they told me that not I was anti-commercial and anti-recreational,
Mhm.
because I said that we shouldn't catch fish during spawning season in one part of the area, and not forever, but just so that we would have fish. And um, it all comes down to jobs. So I'm curious, and I do hear it from the guides, but the guides are incentivized to say that because they're going against the commercials, and even the light tackle guides at some level fight with the charter captains who are on a bigger, sort of different, more efficient type of fishing tackle. Like, what's your assessment? Where are we?
So I agree, and certainly the general consensus is that the Chesapeake has sucked for the last 10
Yeah.
years. And I think there's a few different things going on there. For one, as you alluded to, the commercial fishing fleet is very politically connected. They have a lot of sway, no matter what party has the governorship or what party has the House and the Senate. They're still very sympathetic to that commercial industry. And I understand that because, it's a culturally and historically relevant part of the Chesapeake Bay, and they, to some extent, want to keep it afloat. So I think, all those gill nets are probably having a bad effect on the fish that tend to hold inside of the bay proper. I also think there's something going on that's related to climate change, whether it's some sort of multi-decadal oscillation or whether the bay is just getting warmer, because you look at the young of the year indices and they're clearly trending down. And I don't think the Chesapeake Bay is the producer area that it once was. And just in case the listeners aren't familiar with the biology of striped bass, they're anadromous, like a salmon. They spawn in natal estuaries, and they spend their lives in saltwater, and they spawn in freshwater. So those young of the year are really good indicators of what sort of productivity is happening in the bay, and then clearly that's been going down. Why? There's a lot of competing theories, but the general one is that the bay is just getting warmer. So you look at those young of the year indices and you compare them with the Hudson and Delaware, whereas those are going down, the Hudson and Delaware are going up. So I think that there is some sort of northward shift here, and that's not necessarily good news for the stock, because historically 80% of the coastal stock has come out of the Chesapeake. So whether or not the Hudson and Delaware and some of the smaller estuaries up north can produce like the Hudson did is that's questionable. But like I said before, there has been a definitive increase in the last few years, and I think that's the result of some good year classes coming out of the Hudson and the Delaware, as well as some of the good year classes that came out of the Bay. For instance, 2011 and 2015. There really hasn't been a good one since then. But I think we're seeing those fish now mixed in with those Delaware Hudson River stocks, and most of that sort of increase is focused on the New York Bight to Rhode Island. You don't really see it south. You don't really see it south of Delaware, to be honest. And that's where the complaints start, is south of Delaware, and then kind of up in Maine, and they don't have the levels of fish they had prior to 2012. And I think that also adds some to the theory that most of the production is, or considerably more of the production than we've seen, is coming out of the Chesapeake and Delaware, because there's some science that shows that those fish are not the ones that travel all the way up to Maine. So that's, none of that has any real science behind it. Well, some science, but none of that has been proven in any definitive way. That's just kind of what I think. It'd be like I said, I don't think we're out of the woods with striped bass because we had a few good years, especially when you look at the productivity of the Chesapeake Bay. But I do think, the last few years have been an indicator of what we're likely to see for the next few years anyway, as long as the commission doesn't do something fucking stupid like, give the commercial guys more quota, or, loosen up recreational measures. And that's entirely possible that they will, but we'll have to see how things develop. But I will say, I think the slot limit, we had that coastal slot limit between one fish between 28 and 36 inches. I got to tell you, man, the last 3 years, I've seen more 50 and 60 pound fish than I've seen in my entire life. And a good portion of them have visible scars on their mouth. So I think that slot limit, those fish above 35 inches that are being released, are allowing us access to those larger fish. We can't keep them. Most people don't want to keep them. A big fish like that tastes like shit. But it's absolutely, I think that slot limit is effective. And you just listen to the radio chatter. Everybody's complaining about how they can't find a keeper. Everything's either too small or too big. To me, that means it's absolutely working.
Yeah, I agree. We were looking at the Chesapeake Bay's report card, and effectively, I think you put the mark in the sand of 2012, and I would agree it was probably, but it actually goes back further. Chesapeake Bay report card, John, and they spend, I'm using they because I don't participate in this game, billions of dollars a year in cleanup. Billions, John, from the government and raised money. And the report card is continually the same D.
Yeah.
If not, and the argument could be said, well, Brandon, and I'm sure I'm going to hear it when we get out there and get back into the fray, and, well, it could have been worse. Well, maybe it could have been better, because my premise is this, John, is that these nonprofits, and I want to be clear, not all nonprofits. I think there's nonprofits 4 or 5 standard deviations from a normal distribution that really need and should be nonprofits. And the model works. But the main distribution, 2 standard deviations from the norm, we're talking like 70+% of them should not be nonprofits. And it's because basically all their incentive is to get money, raise money by marketing some guilt. Like, hey, John, you work in New York City. You've been contributing to runoff and all this stuff. Give us $50, $100,000, or $100 or $1,000 because you didn't do your good deed. And all they do is chase the next thing. And I look at some of these very large nonprofits in the Chesapeake Bay and I ask, what in God's name have you done? Like, it is not getting better. So my premise, John, is that you need to have for-profit businesses that throw off money that are incentivized to stay in business because they have to earn it. So otherwise, I mean, we could make the argument that one of the most impactful conservation organizations in the for-profit world is Patagonia. And I know that they get mentioned a lot, but the reason that they're able to do nonprofit work is because they sell overpriced clothes to people who want to look cool. And I'm saying that I was early on in the Patagonia Pro stuff. I think they make excellent gear. My shit lasts, and I've tested it. It lasts. I don't think it's more of a square, but it lasts. But they have been able to do that because, and they are not. Yvonne can go out there and say what's real, because the people who buy the clothes believe in real, right? That's the customer, and the money gets thrown off to do these things. In the nonprofit world, John, we did, and I'm not going to name the organization, but we wanted to do a water test on let's call it watershed. And the nonprofit that we were working with and helping had never done a water test. And we said, why in the F would you never do a water test? Like, we are paying for it to help them, but water tests aren't expensive. To do it scientifically adds up a little bit, but let's just all agree it's probably, maybe a few tanks of gas in your boat. It's not a lot. And finally, when we pressed them, they said, well, we were scared what the water test would come back and say, because if it says that there's pollution or runoff, then they didn't finish their sentence, but they did imply it, then the donors won't give us money. So they are not incentivized to make the right decision, nor are they incentivized to put their self out of business. Respectfully to some of these people that I've known for 30 years in the Bay region, they're incentivized to keep getting a paycheck and figure out the next thing to market. And I know I'm going off on a rant here, but I know I'm with the right person to be able to do that, who could appreciate it. This is ridiculous. And there's no SEC like there is on public companies or companies regulating these nonprofits' return on investment. It's a joke. And I just find it very problematic. And my last word will be with this film. Here's what we did over 20 years, investing money, like real money. And here's the results. And the results suck.
Yeah.
I mean, if your charter business was losing money every year and you still have this, as you call it, addiction, or the love, passion for it, eventually
Still got to eat.
Your wife's going to be like, hey, John, like, not working, brother. Like,
100%.
You're going back to the city on the train every day. Start writing more. I mean, am I off on this?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak specifically to
I understand.
Yeah, but I do tend to share your thoughts that ENGOs in general are all kinds of messed up and perhaps self-interested. My reasons are a little different. I think that they're just so polarized, and they don't really see things outside of their box. It's like, people who have very strong, almost unreasonable political beliefs, and they're able to maintain those because they surround themselves with people that think the same bullshit. That's kind of like the culture with these ENGOs. Like they aren't able to think about other stakeholders or other people that are being effective in compromise. And that's become very problematic when management decisions need to be made and you need to have stakeholder support for them. And I don't really know that I could say that I know of any one of them, not trying to address a problem or kind of half-ass addressing the problem just to stay in business. But I wouldn't say that doesn't happen either. So those are kind of my thoughts.
Well, let me interrupt you and throw this out to you. So I used to meet with the head of the Maryland Watermen's Association in a not secret, but we didn't publicize it because it wasn't really a good idea. And his
Yeah.
guy was Larry Sims, and he's
Yep.
since passed
Yep.
away.
Yeah, I knew Larry.
Arguably the most successful commercial lobbyist, if you will,
Mhm.
ever probably to exist, in my opinion, on the East Coast at least. And he said to me one day, we were in Rock Hall, and I think it was at Ford Seafood where we used to have lunch. It's the first place on the right-hand side. I don't know if it's still there. He said, Brandon, I always wonder about the wrecks. They really don't fight right. Something to that extent. And I said, well, why is that, Larry? He said, this game is very simple. He said, do you know why we win? I said, I don't, but I'd love to know. He said, because we show up to the politicians' fundraisers with an envelope
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. And he said, it's not a lot of money sometimes. Sometimes it's $100. Sometimes it's $200. Sometimes it's $1,000. But we always show up, Brandon. And when I went back to the conservation, that's air quotes for those who are listening, organizations, and said, we're not fighting right. Like, this game requires, call it what you want, donations, influence, and the, going back to a statement you just said, is they surround themselves with the same type of people, which was, well, Brandon, that's not how the system should work. Well, you need to make a decision at this very moment. Do you want to change the game, or do you want to play the game that exists and win it? I'm not commenting that the game that we would need to play is morally just, right, or the way that America should work. I'm just saying that's the way it works.
Yeah.
And we need to decide to fight this. So when you say and I know you were just categorically saying that, John, but to me, they're all guilty because they are blinded by the fact that that is how you win,
Mhm.
denying it because in my mind, it could put them out of business. And their goal should be to put themselves out of business to
Yeah.
solve the issue.
Right.
So I don't know, like with that knowledge that that's how the game is won, but you decided that that's not the right way to win. To me, that's just complying with the system and just being a self-licking ice cream cone.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of comments on that. I mean, one, ENGOs aren't, theoretically, they're not allowed to make political donations, but the way to get around that is you start a PAC, and I think CCA was very successful in the South Atlantic and the Gulf by doing that. That never, I don't think really National gave a shit about striped bass up north to try to address things in that sort of way. And I guess it's our own fault for not doing it too. But we certainly didn't have the money to start a PAC or create those sorts of donations that would probably influence policy. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you want things to go your way, that's the way the world works, unfortunately. And for folks to deny that, I think is pretty damn naive. Flat out advocacy, especially when there's jobs involved, is not particularly successful. Historically, it hasn't been.
It's never going to be. It's JOBS always. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just
Well,
saying
it's
that's what it is.
yeah, and I think some ENGOs like the Conservation Law Foundation, Center for Biological Diversity, those guys have been successful in suing people that disregard the law. And of course, you have to have strong laws for that to happen. But that's another way. I'm surprised, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation isn't suing anyone. The whole
Oh, well, they can't do that.
right. Well,
That's
the
not
whole
politically
Riverkeeper
correct.
Network, the Waterkeeper Network, was started by Bobby Kennedy, that revolves around suing polluters. I mean, and that worked. That worked really well. I mean, the Center for Biological Diversity and Conservation Law Foundation and Oceana, I think a few other ENGOs are suing National Marine Fisheries Service now to try to implement new regulations to protect the 350 right whales that are still in existence. And
Yeah, I was waiting for us to get to that. I was gonna ask you point blank, but I read your article on that, and, well, why don't you finish your thought, then we'll talk.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
interested in your thought because you've gotta be conflicted about that.
100%. My point is that, in addition to making political donations, suing people is another way to really get things done. Sometimes it's pretty bad, but sometimes it's not.
Do you believe that, John? Have you seen that really works?
Well, yes, in the Hudson River and Jamaica Bay, actually, the waterkeepers sued the city sewage treatment plants there, and required them to have a what's the word I'm looking for? The effluent, the fresh water that comes out of the treatment facilities had to, pass a higher test than it had. And since then, the water has been orders of magnitude cleaner. And, the fishing has actually gone down as a result, because I think a lot of that was driven by that sort of nutrient rich water and an artificial estuary and that sort of thing. But if you look at it objectively, was it good for the bay? Yes. That's kind of one small example. There's probably dozens of other ones, but some of these big NGOs suing National Marine Fisheries Service and forcing them to implement measures that are, first of all, they're unrealistic, and second of all, they're likely not going to do a damn thing for the resource. I think that's kind of misdirected, and maybe it's meant to shine a spotlight on it, get more donors and that sort of thing. I don't know, but it's quite destructive to folks, particularly recreational fishermen, who are probably uh, the best stewards of best stakeholders, best stewards of the resource. To alienate them is probably a pretty bad idea.
So this goes into this right whales for listeners. There's an issue where right whales are being struck by boats, and National Marine Fisheries Service on the East Coast has said that there will be I don't know, what is it? Why don't you talk about it a little
Yeah.
bit more? I'm just
So
trying to set it up for listeners who understand this issue.
so yeah, there's right whales are they've always they they were I'm not sure how far and how much detail I should go into here, but they were always back in the whaling days called the right whale because they were lethargic, very easy to approach. When you stuck a harpoon in them, they just roll over and die. They would feed by, unlike a humpback or a fin whale, they would feed by filtering krill and other copepods. So they basically just spend their life on the surface skimming stuff. Um, they also tend to catch themselves in commercial fishing gear, particularly lobster pot lines. They do that by swimming into the line, and instead of saying, ow, that hurt, and moving, they somehow get in the line and twist around and tangle themselves up. But there's only 350 of them left, and a lot of that mortality theoretically came from the fact that their food source just is not incredibly abundant anymore. They're spawning less often. They are generally less healthy, less of a fat content. So there's a lot of things at play here, and a lot of that is climate driven too. Everything seems to be moving north, including the krill that they feed on, and they're not in the traditional grounds that these animals are accustomed to swimming to every year. So a lot of that is going on. What one source of mortality is, of course, ship strikes, but they're not terribly frequent, and they're generally strikes by commercial traffic, not recreational traffic. So back in 2008, to try to save these animals, they put in a regulation that during certain times of the year in certain areas where scientists determined were most likely to coincide with right whales migration, boats that were 65 foot and up would have to go 10 miles an hour, and that was implemented in 2008. But right whales have not gotten any better or more prolific since then. So uh, this coalition of environmental groups decided that they were going to sue NOAA Fisheries under the Endangered Species Act, and essentially forced them into doing something else to protect this species. Now, speaking personally, and this has gotten me into a little bit of trouble with the ENGOs. I think, and it's not their fault. And I think right whales are dumb animals. They're not apt to survive in this day and age. And I think if you shut down all marine traffic, they'd still probably continue to head south, unless there was some sort of major spawning event, and that has happened, decades ago for inexplicable reasons. But it hasn't happened since, and I think that's the only way you're going to see numbers increase. So the new measures that they're recommending as a result of this lawsuit is that they want boats that are 35 feet and over to only go 10 miles an hour during a very significant portion of the year, out to 100 miles, which would pretty much kill my charter business. And I got to tell you, I've never even seen a right whale here. Their food source isn't here. If they are here, they're transiting through. And there's only 350 of them left on the East Coast. So I doubt I ever will see one. And I think the odds of me hitting one with a 36-foot boat are, I have a better chance of winning the lottery or getting struck by lightning, either one. And I also think that it's virtually unenforceable. You're talking 100 miles out. Who's going to monitor that? Who's going to keep these boats? So it's just like one of those feel-good, ridiculous proposals that's likely to create a lot of problems for businesses like mine. Given that I have held these positions on the council and the commission, and hopefully I will hold ones in the future. I'm going to be one of the only ones that really does have to comply, because if I get busted, they're going to nail me to a cross. So, I could still operate the smaller boats, but I think, it's kind of a good example of ENGO overreach or virtue signaling. It's okay. We have to do something, even though this is not going to work. We're going to do it. So anyway, it's a proposed rule now. It remains to be seen what the actual rule they put into effect is. But I'll survive. We talked about evolution in this business. I'll evolve, like I always do. But it's ridiculous, and it's created a lot of mistrust, I think, between ENGOs and recreational fishing, the recreational fishing community.
But their incentive, going back to it, is to need to get people outraged.
Yeah, like, look, we're doing something, even though it's not going to make a fucking bit of difference.
No. I mean, and I think that's I'm getting some echo, John. Hold on. I don't know what that's from. It's like it started all of a sudden, but we're back. I think that it's just the incentive structure of these. They have to. I'm trying to remember a quote, but actually, Tom sent it to me the other day. It was from Pamela Anderson, and she said something about NGOs, and their whole thing is basically just get people riled up. And this could be an example. I mean, I've always gone back and forth. I love to, not back and forth, but if we don't sacrifice things ourselves against our own self-interests, then we're just as bad as anyone who is in these echo chambers and self-licking ice cream cone. I think your logic is probably sound. Like, you hate to say it, but you have to ask yourself, can that species survive?
Yeah.
Not because they should be struck. I think that's terrible. We have issues here on the West Coast with whales getting struck because they come right into the surf line here in Half Moon Bay. I mean, you can see them, and I don't think anybody wants any species to be extinct, but it's not because boat strikes have killed that species or will kill that species. It could just be, and people who don't believe in global warming, you sort of, okay, let's just take that out. Like, let's take all of that out, and let's just say human pollution, netting, very efficient things. If you kill their food source and they have to go look for food in other places, and those other places have warmer water than they are traditionally used to, global warming or not, as you go south, the water gets warmer. That's not, I think that's always been the case. Then you have to ask yourself, and I guess the question is, when do you draw that line?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Like,
uh, I think at some point, if a species can't coexist with other species or its environment, it's, you got to let natural selection take its course. And I know that sounds callous. And of course, if there's any way to protect the right whale, I'm all for it. I mean, whales in general have become a pretty significant part of my bit. Like, people freak out when a whale breaches, and I do too. It's awesome. And I'm not, and I'm sympathetic to their plight, but I don't think that there's really anything that we could do. And I think there's actually probably ways to develop measures that would reduce the chance of a ship strike without, putting people out of business. I just think that the NGOs kind of forced NOAA into this quick, blunt measure where they really didn't have the opportunity to take it out to the public and have a discussion with the stakeholders, like, what could we do to help? Because I think most stakeholders would want to do what's right and would want to protect the right whale. Instead, you have this drastic, blunt measure that's going to really create a lot of angst. So yeah, I mean, it sucks, but like I said, we'll see what happens, and I'll evolve.
you made a post just in the last few days. I saw it on your Instagram. It might have been in other places around commenting, and you were talking about the ASMFC, Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, opens things up for public comment, and sometimes they overwhelmingly get a support from one side or the other. And it's I mean, public comments are public comments. You can read them, you can tally them, and you can see them. And your comment was that people get really upset when they see one side of the or not. This isn't a side thing. It's just there's a group of people who overwhelmingly are in support of a measure, and then the ASMFC feels like they don't take it into account. And you said something to the effect that people don't understand what the public commenting uh, period was really designed for. Could you just, the post, you're probably only allowed so much, and you normally write articles on that stuff. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because
Yeah.
I'm actually curious how how they take it into account, or how they should maybe take it into account, and how the public may be under the wrong assumption of what that means.
Yeah, so I think a lot of folks believe that, if there's an overwhelming number of comments for one option, and usually uh, because just simply by the nature of the stakeholder community, there's going to be more recreational fishermen than, say, commercial fishermen. There's maybe more NGOs and that sort of thing. That it's a vote, that it's a referendum, and that the commissioners have to just do what they say. I mean, if that were the case, it really wouldn't be a need for a commission at all. You just take these votes and do what the public wants you to do. But I guess my point was, you get what's called what did I describe it as? A tragedy of the masses, or tyranny of the masses, or tyranny of the majority, where uh, simply because there tend to be more recreational fishers, that they drown out the commercial interests. And I think commissioners and council members are not relieved of their duty to represent all stakeholders just because one group tends to have an overwhelming response. And uh, that's just the commissioners use public comment as context in their deliberations. And don't get me wrong, it's very important for commissioners and council members to understand, how various options are going to affect stakeholders, and perhaps more importantly than that, they got to understand that they're going to be accountable. The public's watching; they're going to be accountable for whatever decisions that they do make. But in the end, they have to look at the overall picture, and it's not a vote. It's, you don't get to just take a vote, see what the public thinks, and that's how the decisions are made. And this, I guess what concerned me the most about this particular instance was striped bass and the addenda to allow for a commercial quota transfer, which would inevitably increase fishing mortality. All they did really was vote to postpone considering the commercial quota transfer addendum. And folks got really upset that, well, there's 2,000 comments. You just throw the darn thing out. And the next thing that followed was, a dozen comments about how the commission doesn't pay any attention uh, to public comment, and I think that sort of thing influences people not to participate. The truth is they do consider that public comment in a number of ways, and it does affect their decision making. And just because they don't choose your preferred option all the time does not mean that they're not paying attention and that they're just completely disregarding it. Um, and they didn't even choose an option yet, which is, I think the whole thing got blown way out of proportion. And the end result is that, we're going to have a really hard time rallying people again when we really need something and where there's a critical decision that's going to be made. Frankly, when you're looking at this particular issue, you're talking about maybe a 1% increase in commercial landings, whereas you look at that compared to what's been, an exponential increase in recreational fishing effort over the years, which, happens in a fishery that becomes popular and more abundant, like it did, it was basically collapsed, and all of a sudden, we started managing them, right? And you had all these fish around. Of course, the fishery grew while the commercial fishery was kind of capped at their quota, and they have been for a long time. And, the way they look at it is you're talking about a 1% increase here with us. And meanwhile, you guys have increased by like 50, 80%. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that 1%, I don't believe is an existential threat to the striped bass fishery. And I think this was a bit of an overreaction at the expense of, maybe reducing some of the recreational fishing side's credibility and maybe burning people out on the whole process. So that's what inspired me to write that piece. And I imagine it probably pissed a few of my colleagues off or some of my friends, but it had to be said, I think.
Yeah, I think the things that I've always found you say are things that need to be said and have the conversation about and have a real conversation. That's the biggest part
Yeah.
of this country's problem right
Mhm.
now is that everybody votes their party
Yeah.
line, and no matter what, they can't. I don't. Maybe they don't teach debate in schools anymore.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's it's interesting. It's the entire culture has changed, and there's no people don't seek to learn anything from the other side. It's about beating the other person into submission, and that's so fucking unhealthy and unproductive. Because nobody, if you approach things like that, nobody is ever gonna like change their mind because you aggressively try to burn them. It's just, I don't even know how to fix it. I mean, I guess you could blame it on social media. And like I said before, people surround themselves with, you're always going to find a group of assholes that agree with your position, no matter how ridiculous it is. And these people confirm, your beliefs. And they just, once they get that confirmation, that affirmation, they don't feel like they need to reach out to anybody. They don't feel like they need to know the other side of the story. And when you get to fisheries management, that is so unproductive, man. I mean, the idea behind fisheries management is that you take all the stakeholder interests together and you try to develop a compromise that usually nobody's going to be happy with. And I guess the important thing is overall sustainability, not who gets to kill more fish. It's whether or not we're going to have access to all those fish in the future. That's important to me, and that's all getting lost, I think. And I don't know how to fix it. And frankly, we're not going to fix it in our lifetimes. It's going to be our kids' problem.
No, it's not gonna.
Oh, it's not
It's
gonna.
never gonna
It's
fix.
never
People
gonna
don't
fix.
learn how
People
to do
don't learn how to do
critical
critical
thinking
thinking
anymore, John.
anymore, John.
Yeah,
Like,
but it all seemed to have changed so rapidly. Like it wasn't like that this 10 years ago. It just wasn't. Um,
oh, John, it was like that 10 years ago.
well,
Come
it's
on,
not
John.
as bad.
You and I forget.
Yeah.
It's been so divisive for so long, and it's gotten worse. And I agree with you that social media is doing that, but there's this lack of willingness to really have a real discussion. And I don't know that that's because people are tired, lazy, or they just want what they want. And the danger of this is it's called the insignificant, I can't even pronounce it, majority, which is that a very small majority of the people who never compromise can actually get their position done for the majority.
Yeah.
And the problem is the majority are out fishing. They're out living their life, trying to earn a living to buy the boat or have some recreational time, and don't have effing time to deal with this. And then you live with the consequences. And the right whale situation, I'm not making a comment that right whales don't have a right to live on Earth and all of this stuff. There is evolution and all of that come into play. But I wonder if that's a minority, if that truly is the majority of people, or is that a minority of nonprofits who need to raise money for something, who have now are going to impose on the majority of people. And, one of the things, I say this a lot, John, is I adore my wife. And one of the things that I adore and frustrates me at the same time, and only people who have been married a long time will really, truly appreciate that, is that she doesn't care about the Joneses. Like, she lives her life in what she can control, and is able to literally, John, like, no heart, no gray line. Just like, can't control it, don't worry about it. And, I admire that, because that's hard to do in not worrying or comparing yourself, right? I'm not saying that she doesn't look at people who are more successful in whatever she does and aspire to that. I'm just saying it doesn't fundamentally affect her core. And I the last few years, I was like, listen, baby, you've got to speak up sometimes, because if you don't, that minority who is loud, does not compromise, will get their way. And now we will all live with this BS position that never took the other one into account. And I think that's a danger, John.
I agree.
But I want to spend more time fishing these days. And I don't know if that's age or anything. Like, I don't want to wade back into that fight.
Yeah.
The only fight that I'm willing to wade in, the only way I'm willing to play the game, is the way that we talked about you win the game, which is with influencing the people in charge. And somebody could say, Brandon, you're selling out, or no, I'm not. I just want to win.
Yeah.
I want to do the right thing.
And I'm kind of with you there. And I pretty much don't do much in the way of grassroots advocacy anymore. I feel like I've grown out of that. And from May through December, I just want to fish. And the only real engagement that I feel like I still want to have is actually sitting behind the table at the commission or the council. And I'm kind of taking some steps to get back on as a legislative proxy. The guy I represented before retired. Because when you sit behind the table, you're not just pushing people to contribute to the process. You are part of the process. You actually have decision-making capability, and you have a vote. And that's really the only thing that I feel these days is more important than fishing, or at least as important as fishing. And I'm not gonna waste my time on fucking ridiculous Zoom calls that suck a little bit of my soul out every time, or trying to talk to the public about issues that are so nuanced that I have a hard time understanding them, much less explaining them to people. So I'm kind of past that part of my life, the grassroots advocacy part, and talk about burning out. It's something I just don't want to do anymore. Because like we said before, people are so focused on their own little camps, and you really, it's tough to convince them, that their point of view is a little less comprehensive than it needs to be to make an informed decision or have a good policy. So that's where I'm at now, man.
Yeah, I think it's a good position. I just wonder what where I may differ a little bit, and maybe we'll go fishing this year and flesh this one out. But I actually am not sure I even want to hold one vote, because what I found was that if you are in the system and only have one vote, I get it that you can influence other votes, but I found that the power may actually sit outside that circle in influencing multiple votes from multiple places. But I think one thing that you have done, and you've always done for the rec fishermen, is to just, you have come back and said, "Hey, look, man, I get it. You're angry, you're upset, you're emotional, whatever, but we have to be realistic here. You're what you're asking for is never going to happen." And I think there's a role for that. I just worried when I was on that Sport Fish Advisory Commission, which was the Maryland commission. I felt like at the end of the day, John, I was just in their system because then they could control me. And I ultimately believe, after a few of those people have since passed away, and I've learned, is that was their whole goal with me, was to recruit me to get me in the system so that they could keep me in that box, because then they had more control. And I just think outside. So I wonder what that looks like. But I think I am so tired as I've gone back, and we are going to build this film, but John, I feel like I'm in Groundhog Day. Like I checked out 9 years ago, and I'm reading the same thing. They're lobbying Menhaden in Reedville. Like, am I? Did something, like, did I go in like, I haven't been smoking dope. I really haven't, like, haven't been doing any of that. But you people are now talking about the same effing thing, and you haven't done jack all. And, some people just like drama, so maybe that's the way it's going to be. But how do you think the fishing season is shaping up right now? It's February. We're recording this in February. It'll be out soon. Like February, March, you'll start doing some. Do you run the boat out on your own to
I start
sort of do some scouting?
I put the boats in usually that third week in March, maybe the fourth week. I start poking around. But God, the weather stays this way, I expect we're going to have an early season. Like I said, if last year is any indication, I think we're going to have a pretty good striped bass year. I should note, though, because there were so many fish around, not only those big ones, but also a lot of slot fish, and presumably those are the 2015s. Striped bass,
We're talking about
Sorry
striped
about
bass.
that. So one of the caveats there is, because there were so many fish around, I imagine that the recreational fishing surveys are going to show an increase in fishing mortality. So then we're going to probably be right back in that situation where we're overfishing again. And that's going to suck. That's going to create a whole nother management conundrum. But just getting back to the fishing, I think we're trying to lighten stuff up now. I expect this spring to be a pretty good one. I do. There's a lot of fish around last year, man. Some of you remember those things that we had seen in Montauk where we had the boils and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that disappeared. I know you kind of haven't fished.
Is that true?
After 2012, I mean, there would be like one or two a year. I stopped going to Montauk because it just wasn't worth it anymore. But you'd see those sorts of blitzes occasionally, and 10 boats would get on them and be gone. You wouldn't see them for the rest of the day. There weren't these sort of like biblical masses of fish that you and I saw last time we were out there. That just didn't occur. Last year was the first year I'd seen it, and it's.
So it did happen last year.
It did happen
like
last
the old
year,
times,
and it didn't really happen in Montauk. It happened out our way. I think that's the number of menhaden we have here has increased dramatically. Whether that has to do with that 20% reduction way back in 2012, I don't know. I mean, personally, I tend to think it is, but that sort of bait is driving a lot of the fishing here. And not only that, but forget about right whales for a minute. There's humpbacks everywhere, man, just crushing these bunker schools. I mean, those bunker have brought so much life into that New York Bight area, and the striped bass fishing. So we had the adult bunker first, and that's when we were getting the 50s and 60s, and then they kind of moved south, and then we had the peanuts flood out of the bays, and it was just blitz after blitz, slot fish after slot fish.
Are you seeing the bluefish and the albies in there,
man.
like Montauk?
So the albies, that's interesting because we haven't had a good albie season in an awful long time. Now I can tell you firsthand, if I go out to 20, 30, 40 fathoms. And from late August into early December, it's loaded with albies out there. They're a pain in the ass. You can't get through them to catch the real tuna. But inshore, I don't really book albie trips anymore because they don't really come in. It's still pretty good slug of them that pass through Montauk, but it's nothing like it used to be, man. And do I think albies are depleted? I don't. I just think they're staying out so much bait offshore. There's no reason for them to come in. Bluefish, yeah, there's been a pretty definitive lack of fish for like the past 8-9 years. They're starting to come back a little bit, and they're not really in their historical places. There used to be a mud hole.
I mean, we had giant
Yeah.
bluefish up by you and out in the
So-
ocean and even Chesapeake Bay
So
Bridge Tunnel.
something's happened there, and we do have those giant bluefish that come in and they get up on the flats and they tail. It's almost like bonefish, it's really cool. But we don't have those like massive blitzes that we used to get. So, but it's not terrible. There's fish around. Without a doubt, striped bass outnumber bluefish, and it used to be the other way around. Particularly during certain times of the year. But I think bluefish, there's been no increase in fishing mortality. I think it's just a matter of they're widely cyclical. You get big slugs of them. They come in for 10 years, and then they're God knows where for another 10 years. I don't think the bluefish aren't a big food fish. I don't think they're not really targeted recreational in the same way striped bass, summer flounder, scup is. I don't think we're in any real danger of having a collapse of bluefish. And the tuna fishing.
Hey, can we take a
Sorry, go ahead.
Can we take a pause
Yep.
1 minute? Yeah. Are you okay on time?
Yeah, I got to get my kid in about 15 minutes.
All right. Well, we'll wrap up. Just one thing. There's somebody
Yeah,
at my
no
fucking door.
worries.
All right, we're back. Sorry
No
about
worries.
that. So you're talking about the not as many bluefish and not as many big ones, but then I interrupted you and you were going to say something about yellowfin tuna.
Yeah. Well, I was going to talk about bluefin first.
Okay.
Last 2 years weren't particularly great for me. We got slugs of fish, but they didn't stick around for very long. And why that's the case, I don't know. It's not bait. So in prior years, what's happened is you get your bluefin run first in June, July, and then all of a sudden you're out bluefin fishing. You catch a yellowfin, and after that you may catch one or two more bluefin, but that's it, man. They're gone, and you don't really see them again until October, November, December, if you could get to them, which oftentimes you can't because of the weather. But I think what's been happening, and I used to think it was a water temperature issue, whereas maybe the water got too warm for bluefin and the yellowfin moved in on that bait. But 3 years ago, we didn't see one yellowfin, and I had bluefin all the way from May all the way through September. And I think what happens is once those yellowfin come in, there's competition and maybe pushes the bluefin out. Because I mean, it's not unusual. well, I wouldn't. It is kind of unusual to catch bluefin and yellowfin on the same trip. It does happen, but it's not frequent. It's weighted to one or the other. But I think it's a matter of abundance. So those bluefin, kind of have been spending a few weeks here and then shooting up north to Cape Cod, and you could clearly track that on social media because those guys are killing them up there. So I kind of have been focusing more on yellowfin. Not only are yellowfin, like when you get in them, you catch a lot of them, but they just tend to be easier on anglers. They're not, they're 100 pounds instead of 250 pounds. So that's kind of, like I said, you always got to evolve and you always got to kind of change year by year, decade by decade. There's always something new and something different. I guess that's what keeps it interesting. If it were the same shit all the time, I'd probably get bored. But you're always understanding how much you don't know, and you're always trying to figure shit out. And I think that's part of the allure.
One of the things I'm laughing about is I was reading your website a few weeks ago, and it said, "We're light tackle fly fishing. We don't troll because that's just lame." And that is literally on your professional fishing guide website, which is just classic, man. Like we don't do that. It's just lame.
I don't know if you can read my shirt, but it says if it were called trolling, it'd be easy if it were called trolling.
Yeah, exactly. Look, there's something to be said for trolling. It's not for me. I get bored. I'd rather run around and not catch a fish all day and at least try to catch a fish than sit on the back of the boat. But for some people, trolling's a very efficient way
a lot of my network, those are guys that troll or just adjust. If you got to troll, that's the only, the fish are spread out, and I get it, and they do that. I've kind of painted myself into a corner where I developed an entire business around not trolling. It's just not even an option for me. And, we break each other's chops. Right. It's all in good fun. But it's funny, if you write anything that's derogative about trolling, people get so like hurt by it.
You hear me hedging right now.
Yeah.
People are going to come out against you and I can see the comments on this one. Well, not anti-trolling.
Yeah, me neither.
Troll for sailfish and big fish, and I think there's something to it. It's just a personal thing.
It's almost like a personality trait. Like I just don't have the attention span to troll, and I suck at it, and I'll never do it. It's just not my thing,
It's lame, man. So you got your son out there. Is your son fishing now? Actually, at first I saw him sticking some fish, and then I saw him driving the boat.
Yeah, well, he runs a skiff pretty well. And we let him take it out by himself sometimes, but you gotta do it under the radar, and you hope mom doesn't find out. But yeah, he's a pretty good fisherman. If I got a group of good clients, I'll take him as a mate to tuna fish. He's still very young. He doesn't have a lot of upper body strength, and that takes a lot of that sort of thing. But he's definitely got the bug. He thinks he's going to take over the business. I'm trying to tell him that's a fucking stupid, terrible idea, because who knows what the future is here. I mean, I'm so invested, I can't stop, but I'd hate to see him go down that path. But if he's got the bug, and there's no stopping that, and I'm not gonna lie and say I'm not proud of him to some extent for having that. And he's a hell of a good surfer.
I see that. I was going to say he's like a mini you. You got him out there in the middle of the winter in, I don't know what millimeter.
Listen, dude, I don't want to go. Every day we look at it, I'm like, it's too cold. And he calls me a pussy. He's like, come on, we got to go. But he's absolutely fearless. He drops into some really big waves and gets the crap kicked at him and always pops up. And he's like, I'm okay. But it's fun to watch. I mean, don't get me wrong. He's a typical preteen pain in the ass, and he talks back to me all the time. But he's a good kid. I'm proud of him. My daughter too.
Funny how that happens. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it?
No, it doesn't. But it's interesting because he always was very adamant about not learning how to surf up until a few years ago. And then I guess he figured it out. It got cool. And now he's like, borderline insane about it,
Well, I appreciate it's been a good conversation. I've really enjoyed catching up with you. We're going to come out and do some striper fishing. I think that I'd like to stick some tuna, but I got to be honest with you. We're going to have to bring somebody who wants to reel them in. because I don't know how up I am for that. But winding up here, I was trying to think like if I was going to have John give only 3 pieces of advice. Actually, I'm going to challenge you on this one. I was going to say I'd say running a business. We covered sort of running a business and had some good tips, but what 3 tips would you give fellow fishermen out there to become a really great fisherman? And you can only give 3.
Now, I think the big one is time on the water, man. More time on the water. I'm not going to try to claim that I have any special ability. I most certainly don't. And if anything, I'm lacking in ability. I'm just very persistent, and I have this addiction. And it's spend a lot of time on the water. You catch fish. You have your good days and your bad days. The good days are the ones you're going to see on Instagram, and maybe I look like a superstar, but I'm not. The other thing is, I think, persistence. You have a couple of shitty days, it doesn't mean you're a bad fisherman. And, you know, other people outfish you sometimes, and that always sucks, particularly when you're kind of known as the guy that doesn't strike out, but it does happen. So yeah, persistence, and I guess if you're looking to make a business out of it, I always thought do what you love, and the money will follow. I don't know necessarily that you could count on a lot of money, but I think that saying is very true. I think I'd be pretty unhappy if I had to sit behind a desk right now at this point in my life. And I kind of made that jump, and I'm glad I did. I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to do it. I'm not getting any younger, but I'm glad that my life took the route that it did.
Well, I think you gave some fishing advice that actually bleed over into business and life. So those are really good. John, where can listeners find you and your charter business?
nyctuna.com.
We will put that in the show notes. Hey, man, I'm looking forward to seeing you in person. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.